Sometimes people say, "You changed my life," and we smile, but inside we hesitate. Because the truth is, we didn't save anyone. We didn't rewrite their story. We simply showed up. We listened when the world was loud. We stayed when it would have been easier to walk away. And that's when you realize something important. Real change doesn't come from grand speeches or perfect advice. It comes from presence, from kindness, from choosing to be human. Today, this isn't a speech about becoming a hero. It's about understanding the quiet power you already carry and how the smallest moments of sincerity can echo through someone's entire life. People say it sometimes softly or suddenly, like they're handing you something fragile. "You changed my life." And the first instinct isn't pride, it's confusion, because you replay every moment you remember, and none of them feel heroic. You don't remember saving anyone. You don't remember having the right words at the right time. You remember being tired. You remember being unsure. You remember showing up without knowing if it mattered. And when someone tells you their life shifted because of you, it feels almost misplaced, like they're thanking the wrong person. But maybe that's the point. We grow up thinking change comes from big gestures, from speeches that shake rooms, from advice that sounds certain, from people who seem to know exactly who they are and where they're going. We imagine transformation as something loud and obvious, something that announces itself. But real change rarely asks for permission, and it almost never makes noise. Most of the time, it happens quietly while no one is paying attention. It happens when someone is falling apart internally and realizes for the first time that they're not alone in the room. It happens when they're seen without being judged, when they're heard without being interrupted, when someone stays instead of leaving, even when there's no clear reason to stay. And that's where the words, "You changed my life," really come from, not from perfection, not from strength, not from answers, from presence. There was a time when I didn't understand that. I thought impact required certainty. I thought you had to know what you were doing to matter. I thought if you didn't have the solution, you were wasting everyone's time. So I stayed quiet more than I should have. I hesitated when people needed honesty. I pulled back when I felt unsure because I didn't want to say the wrong thing. But the truth is, most people aren't waiting for you to say the right thing. They're waiting for you not to disappear. When someone tells you that you changed their life, what they're really saying is that during a moment when they felt invisible, you made them feel real. When they felt disposable, you treated them like they mattered. When they felt broken, you didn't try to fix them, you respected them. And respect can change a person in ways love sometimes can't. Think about how rare it is to be truly listened to. Not the kind of listening where someone waits for their turn to speak, but the kind where they're actually present, where they don't rush your pain, where they don't minimize it, where they don't compare it to something worse, where they let you exist exactly as you are without asking you to perform strength or optimism. That kind of listening stays with a person long after the conversation ends, long after the moment passes. We underestimate how powerful it is to be steady in a world that constantly demands reaction, to be calm in the presence of chaos, to respond without trying to control, to care without trying to own. Sometimes the most life-changing thing you can do for someone is not to abandon them when they don't have their life together. There are people walking around right now who are still standing because someone once treated them with quiet dignity during their lowest moment. They might not even remember the words that were spoken, but they remember how it felt. They remember the relief of not having to pretend, the safety of not being rushed, the comfort of not being reduced to their mistakes. And that memory becomes a foundation. We don't talk enough about how fragile people are when they're becoming someone new, how uncertain it feels to step away from who you used to be. Change isn't empowering at first. It's disorienting, it's lonely, it feels like standing in between versions of yourself with nothing solid to hold on to. In those moments, a single person who believes you're worth the effort can be enough to keep you moving. Not someone who believes in your potential like it's a project, but someone who believes in your humanity without conditions. That belief doesn't shout. It doesn't demand gratitude. It doesn't need recognition. It just exists. And because it exists, it gives someone else permission to exist too. When people say, "You changed my life," they're not putting you on a pedestal. They're telling you that your normal mattered, that your patience mattered, that your consistency mattered, that the way you treated them when no one else was watching mattered. And that can be uncomfortable to accept because we like to think impact comes from effort. We like to earn things we're proud of. But this kind of impact isn't earned through force. It's created through alignment between who you are and how you treat people. You don't have to ride to change lives to change lives. You just have to be real long enough for someone else to feel safe being real too. There's a misconception that influence requires visibility, that if no one applauded, nothing meaningful happened. But the most significant moments in a person's life often happen in private, with no witnesses and no record, a late-night conversation, a message answered when someone expected silence, a look that said, "I see you," when words felt unnecessary. Those moments don't go viral, they don't get quoted, but they become reference points. Years later, someone might still be measuring themselves against the version of who they were when you treated them with respect. They might still be trying to live up to the idea that they were worthy of kindness even when they had nothing to offer in return. And that's how lives shift. Not dramatically, but directionally. People don't usually change because someone told them to. They change because someone treated them like change was possible without demanding proof. That's a rare experience. Most of the world is transactional. Value is measured. Attention is conditional. Patience is limited. When someone encounters a space where they don't have to earn their place, it disrupts everything they've learned about themselves. It forces a question they may have never asked before. What if I'm not broken? What if I'm just unfinished? And once that question exists, nothing stays the same. There's also responsibility in hearing those words. "You changed my life" isn't just gratitude, it's a mirror. It reflects back the kind of presence you're capable of offering. It shows you that who you are when you're not trying is enough to affect the trajectory of another human being. That realization can change you too. It can make you more careful with how you treat people, more aware of how small actions linger, more intentional about the energy you bring into rooms, because once you know you matter, indifference is no longer neutral. But this isn't about pressure. It's not about carrying the weight of other people's outcomes. You're not responsible for fixing anyone. You're not obligated to save anyone. You're not required to always be available or always be strong. The change didn't come from obligation. It came from authenticity, from being yourself without armor, from responding instead of performing, from choosing presence over control. And that choice is available every day in ordinary moments with ordinary people. You never know which version of yourself someone else is holding on to. You never know which interaction became the proof they needed that kindness exists. You never know which moment convinced them not to give up on themselves. So when someone tells you that you changed their life, maybe the right response isn't disbelief or deflection. Maybe it's quiet understanding. Maybe it's recognizing that being human consistently and sincerely is more powerful than trying to be impressive, because lives aren't changed by extraordinary people as often as they were changed by ordinary people who were willing to be present when it mattered, who didn't rush, who didn't judge, who didn't disappear, who stayed long enough for someone else, say, to believe that staying was possible too. Real change almost never announces itself. It doesn't knock loudly or demand attention. It doesn't arrive with certainty or confidence. Most of the time, it slips in quietly, unnoticed even by the person creating it. That's why people rarely realize the moment their life begins to shift. They only recognize it later, looking back, tracing a line through moments that once felt ordinary. We've been taught to associate change with noise, with applause, with recognition, with milestones that can be measured and celebrated. We're told that if something mattered, people would have noticed, that if you made a difference, someone would have said something right away. That impact should be visible, provable, undeniable. But the deepest changes don't follow that pattern. They happen when someone is alone with their thoughts and remembers how you treated them, when they hear your voice in their head, not telling them what to do, but reminding them how it felt to be respected, when they pause before making a choice and realize that someone once believed they were capable of more, even when they didn't believe it themselves. No one claps for that, no one sees it happening, and yet it reshapes everything. There's a strange humility in understanding that the most important moments in a person's life often look insignificant from the outside. A conversation that lasted a few minutes, a gesture that felt small, a response that could have gone either way. These are the moments that quietly recalibrate someone's sense of worth. People underestimate how starved the world is for sincerity, how rare it is to encounter someone who isn't trying to extract something from you, someone who isn't rushing past your discomfort, someone who isn't waiting for you to become easier to deal with. When that kind of presence appears, even briefly, it leaves an imprint, not because it was dramatic, but because it was different. Real change doesn't come from intensity, it comes from consistency, from knowing that someone's tone won't shift the moment you struggle, from knowing that care won't be withdrawn when you become inconvenient, from knowing that your value isn't tied to how useful or impressive you are. That kind of certainty is quiet, but it's stabilizing. Most people are holding themselves together with assumptions they never question, that they're only tolerated, that they're one mistake away from being dismissed, that they have to earn kindness through performance. These beliefs don't shatter all at once. They erode slowly when experience contradicts them. And one of the most powerful contradictions is being treated well when you expect to be judged. When someone meets you without agenda, it forces a recalibration. It creates cognitive dissonance. It interrupts the narrative you've been telling yourself about your place in the world. And that interruption can be life-changing, not because it fixes anything immediately, but because it introduces doubt into a story that once felt absolute. And doubt in this context is freedom. It creates space for alternatives. It allows new identities to form. People often talk about inspiration as something uplifting and energizing. But real inspiration is often quiet and unsettling. It doesn't make you feel powerful right away. It makes you feel seen. And being seen can be uncomfortable when you've spent years hiding parts of yourself just to survive. But discomfort isn't always a warning. Sometimes it's a signal that growth is happening. There's also something important about the absence of applause. When change happens without recognition, it doesn't get contaminated by ego. It doesn't become something you perform. It stays internal, private, honest. The person changing isn't doing it to be praised. They're doing it because something inside them shifted. That's the kind of change that lasts. External motivation fades. Applause ends. Validation expires. But internal alignment carries forward even when no one is watching. The world is full of people who once experienced a moment of quiet dignity and have been chasing that feeling ever since. Not the person who gave it to them, but the version of themselves they were allowed to be in that moment. Calm, worthy, unrushed, unafraid of being dismissed. That memory becomes a reference point, a standard, and standards shape lives. When someone knows what respect feels like, they start to notice when it's absent. When someone has been treated gently during a vulnerable moment, they become less willing to tolerate cruelty disguised as honesty. When someone has been listened to without interruption, they begin to value their own voice more. These changes don't announce themselves. They don't come with declarations. They show up in choices, in boundaries, in quiet refusals, in moments when someone decides not to accept less than they once did, and from the outside it can look like nothing happened at all. There's also a responsibility in understanding how quietly influence works, not a heavy responsibility, but an awareness, a recognition that tone matters, timing matters. The way you respond when someone is struggling matters more than the advice you give, because people don't remember what you said nearly as much as they remember how you made them feel about themselves. They remember whether they felt smaller or steadier after interacting with you. They remember whether your presence added pressure or relief. They remember whether they felt like a burden or like a human being allowed to take up space. Those impressions accumulate, and eventually they shape identity. It's easy to dismiss small actions because they don't feel productive, because they don't come with immediate results, because they don't provide feedback. But meaningful influence rarely provides feedback in real time. Often, you'll never know the role you played in someone else's growth. You might never hear the story. You might never get the credit. You might never realize the timing mattered, and that doesn't diminish the impact. If anything, it protects it. Change that happens without applause belongs fully to the person experiencing it. It isn't shared. It isn't diluted. It isn't dependent on external reinforcement. It becomes part of who they are, not something they did once. There's also something grounding about knowing you don't have to be exceptional to matter, that your value isn't tied to visibility, that your kindness doesn't need an audience, that your presence can be meaningful even when it feels unnoticed. This understanding can free you from the need to perform goodness, from the urge to prove your worth through impact, from the pressure to be memorable, because the most meaningful contributions are often the least memorable to the person making them. They feel ordinary. They feel natural. They feel like nothing special. And that's exactly why they work. People lower their defenses around what feels genuine. They don't feel manipulated. They don't feel managed. They don't feel like part of a lesson. They feel like they're allowed to exist without being improved. And in that permission, improvement happens on its own. There's a quiet courage in choosing to act without recognition, in caring without guarantee, in showing up without knowing if it will matter. That courage doesn't look impressive. It looks patient. It looks steady. It looks like someone who understands that life is shaped in the margins, not the headlines. Everyday moments carry more weight than we realize. The way you respond to frustration, the way you handle disagreement, the way you treat someone who has nothing to offer you. These moments reveal values more clearly than any speech or statement, and values expressed consistently change people, not because they're forced to change, but because they're inspired to align. When someone experiences consistency in a world full of contradiction, it gives them something solid to stand on. When someone encounters calm in a culture of urgency, it gives them permission to slow down. When someone is treated with fairness in a system that rewards aggression, it reshapes their understanding of strength. None of this gets applause, but it gets carried forward, it gets replicated, it gets passed on quietly through tone and behavior, through choices made when no one is watching. People who were once treated with dignity often extend that dignity to others, not because they were too old to, but because it feels natural. And that's how quiet change spreads, not through movements, not through slogans, through example, unnoticed, uncelebrated, undeniable in its effect. You don't have to convince anyone that what you do matters. You don't have to measure it. You don't have to label it as impact. You just have to be consistent with who you are, especially when it would be easier not to be, because real change doesn't ask for attention. It just keeps moving forward, even when no one is clapping. Most people think the ones who change lives are the ones who stand out, the ones who are admired, followed, quoted, the ones whose presence fills a room before they even speak. But admiration is loud and need is quiet. And the moment someone truly needs another human being, they are rarely looking for someone impressive. They are looking for someone real. There's a difference between being admired and being needed. Admiration creates distance. It puts someone above you. It makes you watch from below. Need brings people closer. It strips away performance. It removes the audience. It leaves only two people in a moment that doesn't care how things look from the outside. When someone says you changed their life, it's rarely because they admired you. It's because you met them where they were, not where they were expected to be. You didn't ask them to rise to your level. You didn't ask them to explain themselves better. You didn't make them earn your attention by being strong or articulate or optimistic. You became the moment they needed, not the person they admired, and that distinction matters more than we realize. Admiration can inspire, but it can also intimidate. It can make people feel smaller It can remind them of everything they are not yet. But presence does something else. Presence stabilizes. It tells someone they don't have to become anything before they are worthy of care. Most people don't break down in front of those they admire. They break down in front of those who feel safe. And safety doesn't come from status. It comes from consistency, from predictability, from knowing that the response won't change based on how well you perform your pain. There's a quiet trust built when someone realizes they can show you the unfinished parts of themselves without being corrected or rushed. That trust doesn't form instantly. It develops through tone, through patience, through how you respond when they hesitate, when they repeat themselves, when they don't quite know how to explain what they're feeling. In those moments, advice is rarely what's needed. Direction can wait. What matters is containment, the sense that their emotions won't spill out and overwhelm the space, that someone else is steady enough to hold the moment without trying to control it. That steadiness changes people. It teaches them that vulnerability doesn't automatically lead to rejection, that uncertainty doesn't make them a burden, that confusion isn't something they need to apologize for. These lessons aren't taught through instruction, they're learned through experience, through repeated exposure to calm responses during moments of internal chaos. And once learned, they don't disappear. People carry those experiences with them. They reference them silently when deciding whether to open up again. They remember how it felt not to be rushed, not to be fixed, not to be judged. That memory becomes a standard against which future interactions are measured. That's when life begins to shift. Because once someone knows what safety feels like, they start to notice when it's missing. They become less willing to accept relationships that thrive on unpredictability or emotional distance. They begin to recognize the difference between intensity and care, between attention and presence. This awareness doesn't make life easier at first. It can actually feel lonelier. When you outgrow environments that never offered safety, there's often a period of emptiness before something healthier replaces them. But even that emptiness is different. It's quieter, less chaotic, less demanding, and that quiet is not accidental. It comes from having once been held emotionally by someone who didn't need to be admired to be effective, someone who didn't position themselves as superior, someone who didn't make the moment about their wisdom or strength, someone who simply stayed. There's humility in that kind of presence. It requires letting go of the need to be impactful in obvious ways. It means resisting the urge to turn someone else's vulnerability into proof of your own importance. It means understanding that the moment is not about you at all. That understanding creates space, and space allows people to breathe in a world where everyone is trying to be seen. Choosing to see someone else without demanding anything in return is rare. In a culture that rewards confidence and certainty, allowing someone to be unsure without pushing them toward answers is radical. But that's often what people need most. They don't need to be inspired in the middle of their confusion. They need permission to exist inside it without being judged. They need to know they won't be abandoned if they don't immediately improve. When you offer that permission, you're not leading them. You're walking beside them. And walking beside someone requires adjusting your pace. It requires patience. It requires awareness. You can't rush ahead and expect them to follow. You have to stay close enough that they don't feel left behind. That closeness is what people remember, not what you said, not what you achieved, but how you made the moment feel survivable. There's also something transformative about realizing you don't have to become extraordinary to matter, that being present consistently and sincerely is enough. This realization removes pressure, it softens interactions, it allows authenticity to replace performance. When someone senses that you're not trying to be impressive, they relax. When they feel that you're not evaluating them, they open. When they know that you're not waiting for them to become better before you care, they trust. Trust is slow, but once it forms, it's powerful. It creates the conditions where change can happen organically, not because someone was pushed, but because they felt supported enough to move at their own pace. That kind of change is more stable. It doesn't rely on motivation or fear. It comes from internal alignment, and internal alignment lasts. The irony is that the more you let go of trying to change someone, the more space you create for change to happen. Control tightens, presence loosens, and people grow more easily in environments that allow movement instead of demanding outcomes. Being the moment someone needed doesn't require perfection. It requires attention. It requires noticing when someone is withdrawing and choosing not to ignore it. It requires staying curious instead of defensive. It requires allowing silence when words would only add noise. Silence, when offered intentionally, can be one of the most supportive responses available. It tells someone they don't have to fill the space, that they don't have to explain themselves better, that they're allowed to sit with what they're feeling without being hurried toward resolution. That experience stays with people. It becomes a quiet reference point for how relationships can feel. Not dramatic, not consuming, but steady and respectful. And over time, people begin to model what they experienced. They offer others the same patience they were once given. They become calmer listeners. They become more aware of how their presence affects others. This is how influence spreads without intention, not through admiration, through embodiment. You don't have to teach someone how to be human. You show them through how you respond when they struggle, through how you treat them when they have nothing to offer, through how you remain consistent even when the situation is uncomfortable. Consistency is often underestimated, but for someone who grew up in unpredictability, consistency feels revolutionary. It creates safety where there was once vigilance. It allows the nervous system to relax. It gives the mind room to consider new possibilities. That shift isn't teasable, but it's foundational. When someone finally feels safe enough to imagine a different version of their life, it's often because someone else once made them feel safe enough to be exactly who they were. And that's the moment you became necessary. Not admired, not followed, but trusted. Not remembered for what you did, but for how you stayed. Not as someone extraordinary, but as someone real enough to be there when it mattered. There are moments in life when people aren't looking for direction, motivation, or reassurance. They're looking for permission. Permission to slow down. Permission to feel what they're feeling without immediately turning it into something productive. Permission to exist without explaining themselves. Most people don't realize how rarely that permission is given. From an early age, we're taught to justify ourselves, to be useful, to be impressive, to move past discomfort quickly so we don't inconvenience anyone. Pain is expected to be brief. Confusion is expected to be temporary. Vulnerability is tolerated only if it comes with progress. So people learn to rush themselves. They learn to hide the parts of their experience that don't translate well into results. They learn to apologize for needing time, and then occasionally they encounter someone who doesn't rush them, someone who doesn't treat silence as a problem to solve, someone who doesn't push for clarity before it's ready, someone who doesn't frame patience as weakness. In that moment, something unfamiliar happens. The pressure lifts slightly, the body relaxes, the mind slows down enough to actually feel what it's been avoiding. That shift can be profound, because when someone finally feels unhurried, they start to hear themselves more clearly. Not the expectations placed on them, not the noise of comparison, but their own internal signals, the ones that have been drowned out by urgency and performance. That's where real change often begins, not with action, but with awareness. There's a misconception that growth always looks forward-facing, that progress is about momentum, but sometimes growth requires stillness. It requires staying with a feeling long enough to understand it instead of escaping it. It requires acknowledging uncertainty without immediately trying to convert it into confidence. Most people don't allow themselves that kind of space. And when someone else creates it for them, even briefly, it can feel disorienting at first. They might not know what to do with it. They might feel exposed. They might feel uncomfortable, sitting with emotions they've been trained to suppress. but discomfort, when it's not forced, can be instructive. It tells you where something unresolved lives. It points toward what needs attention instead of avoidance. And when someone stays present with you while you navigate that discomfort, it teaches you that you don't have to face it alone. That lesson is subtle, but it reshapes how people relate to themselves. They become less afraid of their own thoughts, less reactive to their emotions, less dependent on external validation to regulate their internal state. They begin to trust their capacity to sit with uncertainty instead of immediately fleeing from it. That trust builds slowly. It's reinforced each time they remember a moment when they weren't pressured to be okay, when they weren't told to look on the bright side, when they weren't asked to explain their feelings more clearly so they'd be easier to handle. Those moments don't feel dramatic. They feel quiet, ordinary, but they create a reference point for how care can feel without conditions. And once that reference point exists, it changes expectations. People start to notice how often they're rushed elsewhere, how frequently their emotions are minimized, how quickly others move past discomfort instead of staying with it. This awareness isn't always comfortable. It can make familiar environments feel misaligned. It can make certain relationships feel shallow or transactional. But it also creates clarity about what they need, about what they deserve, about what kind of presence actually supports growth instead of just demanding it. That clarity doesn't arrive as confidence, it arrives as calm, a quieter internal state that no longer feels compelled to justify itself constantly, a subtle shift from proving to choosing, and that shift changes behavior. People become more selective about where they invest their energy. They become more honest about their limits. They stop over-explaining their boundaries. They allow themselves to pause without labeling it failure. All of this can be traced back to a moment when someone didn't hurry them. There's also something deeply human about being allowed to exist without direction, to not know what comes next and not be treated as incomplete because of it. In a culture obsessed with outcomes, uncertainty is often framed as a problem, but uncertainty is also a natural part of becoming. You can't move into something new without passing through a space where the old no longer fits and the new hasn't formed yet. That space can feel empty, uncomfortable, undefined, and without support it can feel unbearable. But when someone sits with you in that space without trying to rush you out of it, it becomes survivable. It becomes a place of recalibration instead of collapse. The nervous system responds to that kind of presence. Breathing slows, tension releases, thoughts organize themselves without force. The body recognizes safety not because everything is resolved, but because nothing is being demanded. That physiological shift matters more than we often acknowledge, because people don't make their best decisions when they're rushed. They don't access clarity when they're pressured. They don't grow when they're constantly bracing for evaluation. Growth requires a sense of internal safety, and safety is often created not by what someone does, but by what they don't do. They don't interrupt. They don't minimize. They don't insist on solutions. They don't turn your experience into a lesson. They let it be what it is. That restraint is powerful. It communicates trust. Trust that the other person has their own internal wisdom. Trust that they'll move forward when they're ready. Trust that they don't need to be managed. When someone trusts you that way, it changes how you see yourself. You begin to trust yourself more too. You stop second-guessing every feeling. You become less reliant on external permission to make choices. That internal shift doesn't announce itself. It unfolds quietly over time through decisions that feel more aligned and less forced. People often think that being supportive means being active, offering advice, providing direction, pushing for improvement. But sometimes support means staying still. It means holding space without filling it. It means resisting the urge to be useful in obvious ways. That kind of support is harder than it looks. It requires patience. It requires emotional regulation. It requires comfort with ambiguity. You have to be okay not knowing how things will turn out. You have to let go of the need to be the reason someone gets better. But when you do, something unexpected happens. The person begins to move on their own, not because they were pushed, but because they finally felt grounded enough to listen to themselves. not because they were motivated, but because the internal noise quieted enough for clarity to surface. And that clarity feels different. It's not urgent, it's not dramatic, it's steady. It guides decisions without force. It influences behavior without pressure. It supports change that feels sustainable instead of reactive, all because at one point someone didn't rush them. That's why moments of patience matter more than we think, why silence can be more supportive than speech, why presence, when offered without agenda, can change the direction of a life, not by telling someone who to become, but by giving them the space to discover it on their own.